So speaking of the ship of state, states are playing the great balancing game in the new emerging world order. We've had some fascinating developments this month. So what are those fascinating developments? Well, the Taiwanese and South Korean presidents visited the US. The French and Brazilian presidents visited Beijing, visited China. So, Glenn, why don't you crack on and explain what's going on here as well?
Okay, well, we can give it a go. No, you can talk about the great balancing game that we see, and that's accurate. But I think the balancing efforts of the Brazilians and the Taiwanese and so on, and everyone else fit within what we've spoken about a lot, and all of us have been thinking about in our own time, which is this new emerging world order. And I use order very advisedly because it's not an order; it's the changed world circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's more fluid state. In fact, the Pentagon's term, which is now pretty much used a lot as jargon, which I am not a big fan of jargon, but I like this term, VUCA, quite a bit because it sums up what's going on. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world.
Volatile, uncertain, conflicts.
Complex and ambiguous world, VUCA world. So volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. To those of our listeners and our future viewers who want clear explanations about some of the more arcane terms we use.
Okay, so why is Brazil in the U.S. or I forget the specific examples you gave, but why are the Philippines conducting the largest military exercises with the United States ever? Why did President Macron from France go to China? In each case, there are national interests, of course, involved in specific points. But the larger story that is unfolding, we touched upon at some length in an earlier talk, but these actions fit into it. And that is, you have a world system emerging from the really the post-World War II order, where we're having progressively two, not quite blocs, but two opposing, contending alliances or networks. The U.S. Likes to believe it's championing rules-based order, largely liberal democracies, rule of law and free trade, and then a countervailing power center, bloc, not quite, of China with Russia, and then several other pitiful states. Iran's not a pitiful state, but a couple of other states.
North Korea certainly is.
North Korea, Iran, possibly one or two others. Now, what's very different, fundamentally different from what we've lived in previous generations, is that whereas the Soviet Union was a military rival and peer, at least, of the United States. Economically, it was always a dwarf. China is anything but a dwarf. In some areas, it is now the world leader. And now, per capita, it remains 1/4 as productive as and wealthy as the United States, but it is 4 times as large in population. So it is clearly a peer coming to have the lead in some sectors of critical technologies and economic activity, and others still trailing. And so what differs fundamentally now is that the non-aligned or the global south, states that don't wish to and don't feel vitally threatened by the demands or actions of either of the two powers, can economically benefit from both sides, which is a great circumstance. I mean, it's a very positive one for them to play, them being Saudi Arabia, for example, or Kenya, or Brazil even, able to get the best deal that it can in a system of some competition. So economically, it provides, and even India still, uh, attractive characteristics for all of these states. However, that's globally, economically, and regarding states that do not have strategic or national security issues that predominate. So Rwanda is unlikely to be threatened by the global superpowers, but can benefit from them or be exploited by them. Whereas Ukraine, its national survival depends on what side it takes. So that's with regard to economic issues. But in geopolitics, one of the theories which I find very compelling was developed about 120 years ago by a geostrategist named Mackinder.
Yeah,
And
he's the father of geopolitics in some ways.
I think he's pretty compelling.
Yeah.
And what his description of international politics was, is that you have the Eurasian landmass from Brest in France all the way to Vladivostok, which forms one fundamental entity. And there is not quite a hegemon, but a predominant power, which will be a continental power. That is the defining continent in human affairs, of development of civilizations, clash of civilizations, the evolution of technologies, and everything. That has been the center of human activity and power. And China, clearly, they call themselves the Middle Kingdom for a reason. They were the most powerful, the most advanced, the largest, and they have become so once again. The world has reverted to its historic norm pre 1784, I don't know, 1842, perhaps 1842. But states that are called littoral states, literally on the coast or the margins of this landmass and power, don't necessarily want to be subsumed, de facto, at least, by the great power. And where can they turn? They can only turn one way. They can only do one thing, which is to ally amongst themselves against the superpower, potential, probably real hegemon. And where else can they look other than to each other? The only other great power, which is fundamentally maritime, the United States, on the other side of the world, on a different landmass. And that's precisely what we are seeing once again. What happened to the hegemon, the German Empire, after the 1870s? Well, you had the littoral states in a smaller geographical area, England and France even, and the Baltics and Italy, allying against the continental hegemon. What's happening now is that you see South Korea and Japan and Thailand and the Philippines and Malaysia and even India, which is halting, inefficient, but slowly seeing the light, moving to protect their national interests by allying more closely with the counterbalancing power to the continental hegemon, China, which is the United States. So that's why you are seeing this flurry of activity of military maneuvers of the United States once again back in its only real colony, the Philippines, and why Japan and India and the United States and Australia and New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are increasing their defense coordination, and why you have these visits of the South Korean president to the United States now, well beyond the specific problems of the U.S. having been caught with its hand in the cookie jar in South Korea, and even an invasion of Ukraine, causing ripples in international national security positions.
I'll add a little bit of economic reality to this discussion. Do you think Mackinder has a point? Certainly, he was onto something when he was describing geopolitics in a theoretical framework. But we are living, as I said again, in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. So the imperative of European powers does not neatly align, according to Mackinder's theory, that they have to oppose the dominant power in the Eurasian landmass, which is China. Because if you are the German president, if you are the French president, your biggest export market now is China. After all, French produce nuclear reactors, or rather make nuclear reactors. They manufacture planes. Airbus industry is their biggest, probably, national champion. They make luxury goods, Chanel and Christian Dior. And as I always jokingly say, is that the Chinese may claim to be communists, but they are really now the top consumerists. And Christian Dior is the new god in Shanghai. Shanghainese women are infamous for being extremely fashion conscious, and they lap up French brands. And if you are a French company, your biggest market is China, and you're looking east, not west anymore. So you naturally do not want to get completely aligned with the US, because the CEO is in some ways of any company looking at their biggest market, and so is the head of state today of modern democracies, because they have to protect jobs. It is for this reason that Macron visited Beijing, and it is for this reason that Olaf Scholz flew to China for a day. The poor chap didn't even get to stay the night because of Emperor Xi Jinping's asinine zero-COVID policy. And he was flying in because the recent proverb is very simple. If China sneezes, Germany catches a cold. Each time there has been a blip in the Chinese stock exchange, the German DAX has fallen, because the biggest export market for Germany, for all its machine tools, for all its advanced technical stuff, is China. And this has been the case for a while. The first time I went to China, what surprised me was that the hotel was full of German and American businessmen. The German businessmen were all exporting stuff to China. The American businessmen were all importing stuff from China. Now, it's not as simple as that. Of course, Germany imports a lot of stuff from China too. But Germany's destiny, France's destiny, economic destiny is now inextricably intertwined with China's. China is a big market. And that complexity of relationship even touches the US, because let's say tomorrow, if there was a rupture in US-China trade relations, Walmart would be empty. People wouldn't be able to buy electric kettles, or for that matter, chairs, or for that matter, smartphones, you name it. But the US has natural gas, the US has water, the US has the top universities in the world, the US now has additive manufacturing, not just 3D printing, but also the solidifying of material from liquid, which is cheaper. So the US can afford to be autarkic. The US has a large domestic market. That is not the case for France. That is not the case for Germany. And now I'll come on to Brazil. That is certainly not the case for Brazil, even though it makes fantastic jets. It makes Embraer jets. I just flew in one. But the reality is that German soybeans, German beef, Brazilian soybean, Brazilian beef, and Brazilian commodities make their way to China. And China is the biggest importer of Brazilian goods. So for Brazil, the specter of a Chinese naval flotilla appearing and colonizing them is not real. For Brazil, the Chinese appearing as traders and buying stuff from them, and thereby guaranteeing jobs in their economy, is very real. And regardless of who's president, they will have to keep economic ties with with China, because now they are part of this global economy with its complex supply chains. So we are living in a more fragmented world now.
Well, this is the difference in today's world from the world that all of us have lived in from our births, from 1945 until now. So, from the perspective of 80 years, this is something different. It is rather than a world of two blocks, perhaps two blocks of Swiss cheese, which are quite porous and can't survive without the passage of air currents from one to the other. Even the United States, large as it is, could be autarkic at tremendous cost to standard of living, GNP growth, and so on. Even the United States and even China. No country today, including the three great economic powers, the European Union, China, and the United States, can really go it alone today. You're completely right. And that is the difference from even 12 years ago, and certainly from most of our lives, that the economic interwoven interdependence is unavoidable and mutually beneficial. So it makes it much harder to have a spat because you hurt yourself at the same time. And although I do not subscribe to one of the traditional theories, which is that trade makes war less possible or not.
No, I
possible.
don't either, because they forget, this theory forgets the evidence before 1914. Germany and Britain were each other's biggest trading partners. In fact, the ruling families of both these countries then were related to each other. And yet they went to war, in a disastrous 4-year war. So I'm completely in agreement with you in debunking that theory.
The only thing that seems to make war less likely is that there's a hegemon that imposes a peace of some sort according to its own terms and makes conflict higher cost to everyone else and therefore less likely, which was the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana, but no longer the case when you have the most unstable or the hardest state of nature is an equilibrium. Things resolve to some stasis. And that's a challenge for all diplomats and for all of us. The one other point I would say on this is, yes, it's new, what we just described, the economic interdependence and permeability and need. But in the larger sense, we are emerging from what is historically an aberration, in fact. The reason the Americas were discovered, and that I'm sitting here on the east coast of what is now the United States, is because Europeans were seeking a way to bypass their Islamic rivals, enemies, and superiors who were denying them any access to the silk routes and silk trade.
To Indian spices.
And Indian spices. And silver. It was the effort to bypass them, literally go around them, which took Columbus to discover the Americas. And then the discovery only a couple of years after that of vast silver mines in South America that drove and underpinned, if that's the right word, the global economy from the year 1500 for 400 years. That explains why Spain was a global power and Portugal was, and then England was, and why America exists. The fundamental, the centrality of the Middle Kingdom and its economy. We are now reverting to that.
Very quickly, most people do not know this, but a third of the silver that came out of Latin America ended up in China. So a third that went to Europe ended up in China, and Europeans were buying all sorts of stuff, from porcelain to silk to all sorts of luxury items from China. And of course, they were also buying stuff from India. But the reality is that huge influx of silver into Europe fueled trade. It also fueled inflation. And it also led eventually to the collapse of Portugal and Spain and China. And in China, the Ming dynasty, which brought in the single whip law, which which meant that all taxes had to be collected in silver. And that meant that everything was now susceptible to the demand and supply of silver. And that obviously was catastrophic.
Yeah,
the British later came up with opium. All right, we don't have anything you want, but we can export opium to you.
We can turn you all into drug addicts, and we can monetize our colony in India. But one could say
so famine for the Indians and addiction for the Chinese. Exactly. Death for the brown man and addiction.
Clubs with newspapers in the city of London. That is correct.
Yes.
One could say to conclude this little segment. And I'm not being facetious, the only new thing, because we are reverting to what has been the global dynamic for thousands of years, is the United States. Now, there was no United States prior to the discovery of the Americas, and then 250 years of slow evolution. And that's the only change to this Mackinder geostrategic dynamic of a central power counterbalanced by littoral powers, and the interplay of how they try to neutralize one another to maintain national security. And the U.S. is even now the aberrant, unusual new element that has changed the equation, and it's a reversion now to what obtained before.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.